In today's lesson, we'll be looking at multiplication of fractions. We'll have two objectives. First of all, we will simply be multiplying fractions, and then we will have applications using multiplication of fractions. So let's begin with the rules for multiplying fractions. Our steps are as follows. Step 1, we will factor the numerators. Step 2, factor the denominators, and this should sound familiar because it's very similar to the steps that you used when you were simplifying fractions. Next, we will remove common factors just as we did before, and then we will multiply the remaining numerators to get the new numerator and multiply the remaining denominators to get the new denominator. Let's look at an example. If I give you 2 over 21 times 35 over 6, the first two steps tell us to factor the numerators and denominators, so let's do that. Notice the 2 is prime, so I've left it alone. I then factored the 35 into 5 times 7. I factored 21 into 3 times 7, and I factored 6 into 2 times 3. Once I have these factored, I'm to remove common factors. Remember, for them to be common factors that can be removed, one of the factors has to be in the numerator, and the other one has to be in the denominator, which means I can remove this 2 and this 2, even though they're in separate fractions. One is in the numerator and one is in the denominator. I can remove this 7 and this 7, but I cannot remove these two 3's since they are both in the denominator. What I then do is multiply, according to step 4, the numerators that are left to get the new numerator. Well, notice the only thing that's left in the numerator is this 5, and then I need to multiply the remaining denominators to get the new denominator. So I'll be multiplying this times this, which will give me a final answer of 5 over 9. Now, let's look at some more examples because I realize that 1 is probably not sufficient for us to do. Our next example is 3 over 22 times 33 over 12. Now, if you're feeling pretty good at this, you may want to write this problem down and see if you can work it. Otherwise, you can follow along with me just to get another one under your belt. We're going to begin by factoring the numerators and denominators. So I started this by saying the 3 is prime. I simply wrote it down. I factored the 33 into 3 times 11. The 22 factored into 2 times 11, and the 12 factored into 3 times 4, which I went on and broke down into 2 times 2. Once I have all of these pieces factored, now I'm ready to remove my common factors. Well, I can remove a 3 with a 3. I can remove an 11 with an 11, and that's all that can be taken out now. So what I'm left with is going to be a 3 in the numerator, and then 2 times 2 times 2 in the denominator. So that'll leave me with 3 over 8. Let's continue now with our next example. This time I have 3 over 5 times 7 over 8. So let's begin our process. We will factor all of our numerators and denominators. Well, the 3 was prime, the 7 was prime, the 5 was prime, and I did factor this. This time I want you to notice there's absolutely nothing that can be removed. And so now what we simply need to do is multiply all of these pieces together to get our new fraction. So on the top we'll have 3 times 7, which is 21, and in the denominator we'll have 5 times, and remember this was just an 8, so 5 times 8, so our final answer then would be 21 over 40. By the way, the nice thing is that if you do the problems this way and you remove those common factors, when you get a final answer out here, it is in reduced form and you won't have to go back and reduce it again. The last example I'll work for you is 40 times negative 7 over 8. Got a few steps we need to talk about this time. First of all, let's talk about that 40. I'm going to write it as 40 over 1 so that you see that fraction process and you'll be able to follow through with that. The other thing we need to talk about is this sign. Remember, this sign means that one of the numbers is positive, but not both of them. I am a creature of habit, and I will always move that to the numerator. So I put my negative up there, and I'm now ready to start my factoring. I factored the 40 into 8 times 5. I left the negative 7 alone. There's nothing that I can break that down into. I have 1 over here, and I have an 8. Now, I do want you to notice, I could have taken this and this and broken them down into 2 times 2 times 2, but then all of the 2's would cancel, so I can do that just as easily simply by taking out the 8. If I need to factor further to reduce that, that's fine, but since they already matched, I could stop there. I now need to multiply the numerators and the denominators to get my final answer. Well, when I multiply the numerators, I get negative 35, and there's nothing left in the denominator except a 1, so I get negative 35 over 1. Let me remind you that any number over 1 is just that number, so our final answer here will be negative 35. What I've given you now are some problems I would suggest that you practice with while we're doing this. So I'm going to give you 3 practice problems. I'm going to ask that you stop the video, do these problems, then come back and check your answers just to make sure that you're good with this process. We're back, and let's look at your first practice problem. You had negative 3 over 10 times 22 over 150. And I realize that 150 kind of threw some of you a curve because it's a little bigger number, but you should know the steps to do this. Let me remind you, I'm going to begin by taking that negative and putting it on the top right there with that piece. And then I'm simply going to begin to factor. The 3 is prime, the 22 becomes 2 times 11, 10 over here is 2 times 5. Once again, because this ends in a 0, I know that it is a multiple of 10, so I have 15 times 10. Now I have not completely factored this, and you could have done this all in one step, but I'm going to continue as a separate step now. Negative 3 is okay, the 2 and 11 are okay, the 2 and 5 are okay. I can break down the 15 into 3 times 5 and the 10 into 2 times 5. At this point now, I should be ready to remove my common factors. The 2's eliminate. There is one more thing I need to mention to you here. Notice I'm going to take out the 3's, but don't forget that you still have this negative, and if it helps you to think of this as a negative 1 from here on out, that's perfectly okay. Now I'm ready to multiply my numerators and multiply the denominators to get my final answer. When I multiply the numerators, I get a negative 11, and when I multiply 5 times 5 times 2 times 5 in the denominator, I'm going to get 250. So my final answer is negative 11 over 250. Cannot reduce it any further, or there would have been more common factors. Let's look at this one now. Once again, I have that whole number out there, and I'm going to begin by writing it as a fraction. So I have negative 56 over 1 times 5 over 7. Now I'm ready to factor. When I factor the 56, I did it as negative 7 times 8 over 1 times 5 over 7. Once again, when I take out these 7's that match right here, it may help you to think of that as a negative 1 right there. Now I'm ready to multiply my numerators, and I get negative 1 times 8 times 5, or a negative 40, divided by 1. Once again, any number divided by 1 is equal to that number, so my final answer is negative 40. Our last example here is negative 5 over 12 times negative 12 over 5. I'm going to follow exactly the same process I have been following every step. I'm going to first of all put those signs in the numerators of my fractions. And then I'm ready to remove my common factors. Notice this time there's really not a lot of reason to factor because I already have matching factors. The 12's match and the 5's match. What I'm left with then is negative 1 times negative 1. And so when I multiply negative 1 times negative 1, my final answer is a positive 1. Now before we end today, we want to look at some applications using fractions. I know that many of you are not going to like the words I'm about to say. This will involve word problems. So let's look at our first word problem. A recipe for oatmeal cookies calls for 3/4 cup of brown sugar. Vivian is making 1/2 of the recipe. How much brown sugar should she use? Now, common sense tells you here what we're dealing with. I have a recipe that calls for 3/4 of a cup. Well, let me appeal to your sense of reason for just a minute. If you're going to make half of that recipe, then you only need half of this amount, right? So let's look at how that would look in math. I need 1/2 of 3/4 of a cup. Now, most of you are okay to write there, but here's what I need you to recognize. The word of right here will almost always tell us that the operation that we're going to use is multiplication. So what I'm going to be doing is actually taking 1/2 of 3/4 by multiplying those together. Once again, I would start by factoring my numerators, factoring my denominators. Well, in this case, even if you factor, there's going to be nothing to remove, so I need to multiply the numerators to get my final answer and multiply the denominators. When I do that, what I get is 3/8 cup of brown sugar. Please make sure that when you get this number, you don't stop right there because you also need to tell what that is. So your final answer here is not just 3/8. It's 3/8 of what? It's 3/8 cup of brown sugar. So make sure that you label what your answer is. Let's look at one more application problem. A student's tuition was $2,400. A loan was obtained for 5/6 of the tuition. How much was the loan? Well, now, first of all, make sure you understand here, if the loan is for $2,400, if the student had taken out a loan for the whole amount, the loan would have been $2,400. He only took out a loan for 5/6 of the tuition, meaning not quite all of it. So let me just appeal to your sense of reason one more time and suggest to you that we know before we ever start that the loan value cannot possibly be more than $2,400. As a matter of fact, it can't even be $2,400. It must be some amount slightly less than that. So let's go through this problem. First thing we're going to look at is, once again, how to write it. We'll be taking 5/6 of the tuition amount. So you see it written there, 5/6 of the tuition amount. You should now know what this word indicates, and so we see 5/6 times $2,400. Once again, let's do our factoring and remove common factors. I have 5/6, and 2,400 can be simplified into 400 times 6. Once again, I recognize this is not prime and could be factored further, as could these two here as well. However, once I see those 6's that are going to go away, and I recognize there's nothing else down here in the denominator to use as a common factor and remove factors, I can stop right there, and all I have left to do then would be to multiply and get my final answer is $2,000. By the way, you may want to check just to make sure that makes sense. If the student's tuition dollars was $2,400, the student took out a loan for just slightly less than that, does it make sense to you that the loan could be $2,000? And to me it does. I hope it does to you as well. That's all I have for you today. I hope you'll take the time to practice these and make sure that you understand and remember how to do multiplying fractions. I'll talk to you later. Let me know if you have questions. Bye-bye.